The Pilgrims did not have far to go before they arrived at a delightful stretch of countryside, which had been planned and landscaped especially for the benefit of travellers on the way to the celestial city. Their path now lay along one of the banks of the river of the water of life, which was bordered by trees heavy with luscious fruit and bright with healing leaves. Beyond these fertile banks lay lush green meadows, luxuriant with lilies. For several days and nights, Christian and hopeful remained in this haven, enjoying its delights and finding healing, nourishment, and refreshment. Then they resumed their journey. When the path and the river diverged, the going became difficult, and soon the travellers were footsore and tired. An inviting sight to the left made them pause. This was attractive bypath meadow. Christian noticed that the path which skirted this meadow seemed to be going in the right direction and promised easier walking conditions, so he suggested that they should take it. Hopeful was dubious about the wisdom of this idea, but he allowed himself to be persuaded by Christian's assurance that all would be well, and clambered over the stile onto the meadow path after him. Once there, the pilgrims walked along together. Any doubts Christian might have had about their change of route were resolved when he called out to a fellow traveller not far ahead, "Where does this road lead?" and received the answer, "To the celestial gate." The man in front was called Vain Confidence, and the pilgrims began to follow him. But when night fell, they could no longer see to do this. Christian and hopeful groped their way forward through the dark, but Vain Confidence continued to stride ahead confidently and carelessly. Suddenly he tripped and fell, plunging headlong into a deep pit that lay hidden in his path. The two men behind him heard the sounds, and guessing what had happened, stood still, calling out to Vain Confidence as they did so. But a terrible groaning was all the reply they received. "Wherever are we?" Hopeful cried out, but Christian, now very unsure of himself, gave him no answer. The rain began to fall in torrents, while thunder snarled and lightning zigzagged overhead. "How I wish we had not left our way," Hopeful sighed. Christian was wishing the same thing, but he knew that they had taken the wrong path because of him. So now he asked for, and was freely granted, Hopeful's forgiveness. After that, there was no chance for further conversation, as the travellers were fully occupied trying to fight their way back to the King's Highway. But darkness and flooding prevented them from doing so, and only with great difficulty did they avoid being swept away and drowned. Finding at last a shelter of sorts, they threw themselves down under it and fell into an exhausted sleep. Next morning they were roused by a loud and angry voice, which demanded, "Who are you, and what are you doing in my grounds?" Opening their eyes, Christian and Hopeful were confronted by the towering shape of Giant Despair. They replied that they were pilgrims who had lost their way. At this stage the giant bellowed, "You're trespassers on my land. Come with me." Then he pushed them over the ground towards the grim stone fortress known as Doubting Castle. There he forced them through the door and down some steps into a shrinking dungeon, where he left them. That night he told his wife, Diffidence, about his new captives, and asked her what he should do with them. First thing tomorrow, she suggested, make yourself a crab-tree cudgel and beat them without mercy. Accordingly, in the morning, the giant entered the dungeon and began to abuse the prisoners, after which he beat them until they were almost senseless. All that day and night, Christian and Hopeful writhed and groaned in agony. At bedtime, the giant again asked his wife what he should do to his prisoners. This time, Diffidence suggested, tell them that their best plan would be to kill themselves. In the morning, the giant visited the dungeon and with brutal bluntness told the prisoners that since they'd never escape, they should end their lives that very day by stabbing, hanging, or poisoning themselves. Instead of agreeing to this, Christian and Hopeful asked the giant to release them. Their temerity so enraged their captor that his face contorted with hate and he rushed at the terrified pair. But before reaching them, he became uncontrollably convulsed, as often happened at the onset of one of his fits to which he was subject. This seizure rendered him powerless and saved the prisoners' lives, for the moment. After the giant's departure, Christian became so morbidly depressed that he suggested that they might as well obey the giant and put an end to their misery. Hopeful, however, pointed out that killing themselves would be tantamount to committing murder, an act forbidden by their prince. Besides, he added cheerfully, we may yet escape, for I have heard of others who have been the giant's prisoners, but have managed to break free by God's grace. That evening, on finding that his captives, though barely breathing, were still alive, the giant flew into one of his terrible rages, after which he left the cell, saying ominously, you'll soon be wishing you had never been born. For some time Christian was in a state of stupor. When he was able to speak again, he repeated his suggestion that they should escape their present sufferings through suicide, but Hopeful, true to his name, reminded him of all the dangers he had already survived, adding, I, though weaker and younger than you, am enduring the same hardships, so have patience, my brother. That night, when the giant told his wife about the prisoners' irritating refusal to kill themselves, Diffidence put forward another of her unpleasant ideas. Take them to the palace courtyard and show them the bones and skulls there, she suggested. So in the morning the giant led the prisoners to the courtyard and forced them to look at the gruesome human remains scattered over it. These are the bones of former pilgrims killed by me, he told them menacingly. Then took them back to their dungeon, pummeling them every step of the way. As on previous nights, when they had gone to bed, giant despair and Diffidence discussed their captives. He voiced his surprise and annoyance at their continuing survival, but she, with uncanny perception, replied, either they are nursing a secret hope of being rescued, or they have managed to hide a tool with which they mean at the right moment to pick the castle locks and so escape. Promising his wife that the pilgrims would be minutely searched in the morning, the giant fell asleep. Down below in their cell, the prisoners could not sleep, but at midnight they began to pray, and continued in this attitude until dawn, when Christian suddenly exclaimed, "What a fool I've been! All this time I've had the means of escape right here with me." So saying, he put a hand inside his coat and pulled out a bright object. It was the key of promise. "Let's try it now," suggested Hopeful eagerly. With beating hearts, the pilgrims approached the door of their dungeon and tried the bright key in the lock. It turned easily. The two men pushed the door ajar and stepped out from the den in which they had spent 4 days and 3 sleepless nights without food, water, or light. Then, creeping up the stairs and over to the outer door, they tried the key again. Once more it turned smoothly in the lock, and the prisoners were able to open the door and slip silently out. Now only one barrier lay between them and freedom: the huge outer gates. They reached these without mishap, but this time the lock did not yield immediately to the key of promise. When at last it did, the pilgrims, forgetting caution, pushed hastily at the iron gates, which began to creak alarmingly. Up in his bedroom, Giant Despair heard the sounds and sprang from his bed. As he moved, however, one of his fits seized him and prevented him from going any further. By the time he had recovered, the escaping prisoners had raced across the meadow, climbed back over the stile, and regained the safety of the King's Highway. Before resuming their journey to the Celestial City, Christian and Hopeful spent some time in building, close to the stile, a pillar which they hoped would be a warning to future travellers. On this monument they inscribed the words, "Over this stile is the way to Doubting Castle, kept by Giant Despair, who despises the king of the Celestial City and wants to destroy his pilgrims." Then the pilgrims, singing as they walked, headed for the beautiful mountains, which Christian had glimpsed from the roof of the Palace Beautiful.